This reading is the correction needed to put together all the fields of science under one single explanation. The fatal flaw. There's one flaw in Western thinking which is causing us not to be able to make any sense of science. At the heart of science is a fatal flaw, which is preventing humanity from having a common explanation for physics, chemistry, biology, and all the other fragmented university departments. There is, however, a correction, which can be understood by anybody if they are presented with the right evidence. The correction came from looking at what is common to all fields of study. And the first answer is, all natural systems obey the laws of physics. However, there's something missing from physics, which explains the same systems going on to produce chemistry, genetics, biology, or the weather. Physics is the first set of rules which do not go on to explain any of the other rules. The flaw shows up in the fact that physics is not sufficient to explain A, systems which have unpredictable outcomes, like a chaotic pendulum or the weather. B, systems which drive matter from a disordered state into a well-organized state. Physics only explains systems with regular motion. It does not explain A, any system which is unpredictable. B, any system which is self-organizing. Classical physics only explains systems with single predictable outcomes. A chaotic pendulum, the weather, and biology have multiple complex outcomes, and they work at the classical scale, yet they have no explanation from classical physics. Under the present philosophy, physics is supposed to explain everything else. Since the time of Newton, physics has been considered as a base set of rules, but physics explains no other field of science. Common sense says the building blocks should lead to the building. Before we look at the highly complex systems of chemistry and biology, let's look at two physical systems in which it's easy to see why physics cannot explain cause for action. The simplest system to look at is a chaotic pendulum. Its motion is completely unpredictable, yet Newton's laws of motion are completely predictable. Something is wrong. Self-organizing systems also confound physics by moving from chaos to order. Physics only explains systems which move from order to chaos, and this is bedrock, enshrined in the second law of thermodynamics. We know the second law is correct, but systems like chemistry and biology drive in the opposite direction. So we need an explanation for what is driving them. Biology is very complex, so let's look at a much simpler system which moves from chaos to order, the solar system. Classical physics has no explanation for the fact that the solar system is a very accurate clock. The physics of gravity only explains why the clock moves, so physics provides an explanation for the clock's battery, but not the clock. The clock self-assembled out of nothing more than dust and rubble. That needs an explanation. At the atomic scale, we have the same problem. Physics has no mechanism which explains why a snowflake self-assembles into beautiful symmetrical patterns. So, if physics cannot explain the organization of the solar system or a snowflake, it's never going to explain the organization of complex systems like rainforests or people. We need to start again and ask ourselves, why are we trying to explain the complexity of nature using physics? something is wrong with the philosophy at base. We need to go back in history to the beginning of science and tell the story again using the new information we have from quantum mechanics and computers. Science really started with Newton and his laws of motion. This was the first time we had an explanation for the behavior of bodies under gravity. The force of gravity is supposed to provide a plausible explanation for the motion of the planets. However, there is a fatal flaw in the logic. The force of gravity implies the need for physical contact. But how can gravity apply a force if there's no physical contact between the Earth and the Moon? We should note that atoms also have no physical connections. Later, Einstein threw out gravity as a force, so it must be replaced with a new explanation, and it must not require the need for physical contact. The word force is not appropriate for a gravitational field. Likewise, it's not appropriate for a magnetic field. And how can one magnet apply a force to another without physical contact? There is another vital clue at the birth of science, which until recently people had no access to because it can only be exposed with the use of modern computers. The clue is that Newton came up against the three-body problem. His equations show that two bodies in space have a perfect repeating motion. But if you try to apply the same equations to the motion of three bodies in space, they don't work. They don't just fail, they fail completely, because Poincaré wrote a mathematical proof that in terms of gravity, there is not a single analytic solution to the three-body problem. Proofs are absolute, and this one should have stopped science in its tracks. What nobody could have known is that Newton had stumbled upon a new set of physical laws which sit on top of physics and explain the unpredictable parts of nature. He had discovered the laws of chaos, which, with the aid of computers, are as mathematically provable as Newton's laws of motion. Nobody was suspecting that another set of mathematical rules would emerge to explain the unpredictable systems in nature. Everything, from the weather to a beating heart, follows the same mathematical rules. This is the vital bit of evidence we need to unify the fragmented fields of science. We must have a complete description for the behavior of the elements, which includes the clockwork behavior of the planets, the chaotic behavior of the weather, and the very complex behavior of biology. If we already have a mathematical explanation for chaos and biology, what is the problem in linking them with physics? The problem is that unlike physics, chaos and biology have no explanation which holds forces as cause for action. I should have said classical physics there, but quantum physics is different, as we'll see. And if gravity is also not being held as a force, then the old science is starting to collapse. The collapse is complete when we remember that there are no physical connections at the atomic scale, only fields of space with mathematical properties, not physical ones. Physicality is an illusion caused by the scale from which we view atoms. There is, however, a solution, and that comes from looking at the common explanation for chaos and gravity. The theory of general relativity is the geometric or mathematical explanation of gravity. Matter and space are described as being driven by mathematical rules, not forces. We know without doubt this is also the case for chaotic systems, which are all driven by mathematical rules, not forces. If physics and chaos are both described as systems being driven by mathematical rules, we get a common explanation. It is then very easy to include quantum mechanics in the common explanation because it is already seen as matter behaving to mathematical rules. A previous contradiction becomes a solution. The only thing that links general relativity, quantum mechanics, chaos, chemistry, and biology is mathematics. If we do not see mathematics as providing common causality, then there's nothing else, and science is left with no foundations. Taking mathematics as causality, we can build science back into a self-consistent information which makes sense. Returning to Newton, if we take the behavior of matter and space as being driven by information in the form of mathematical rules, we get an explanation for gravity which does not require space to apply a physical force. Gravitational fields follow mathematical rules, not physical rules. The three-body problem can then be solved by stating that two bodies in space follow the predictable mathematics of physics, three bodies in space follow the unpredictable mathematics of chaos. We now have a common mathematical explanation for order and chaos. Physics does not explain the motion of three bodies in space, but a combination of physics and chaos do. Gravity is not replaced by chaos, it's just added to. Physics and chaos are driven by two very different kinds of mathematics. This is not a problem because it's exactly what you need to explain the very different motions of a harmonic pendulum and a chaotic pendulum, two bodies in space or three bodies in space. Now we have seen that mathematical causality can unify general relativity, quantum mechanics, and chaos. We should apply the same principle to all the other departments in a university. Chemistry can be unified with physics and chaos using mathematics as cause for action. At last, we get an answer for the beautiful geometries of molecules, which have always been a mystery to physicists. As physicist Eugene Wigner said in his essay, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. Why indeed should molecules obediently line up according to the laws of group mathematics? Moving on through the university, genetics can be unified with physics and chemistry, as Mendel's work with peas shows systems of matter following the mathematical rules of probability. Einstein said, God does not play dice, but genetics is exactly that, the study of matter playing dice. Biology can be unified with physics, chaos, and chemistry as the study of matter following layers and layers of mathematical rules leading to the self-organization of the most complex systems. Biology is so complex, it needs a separate information system with instructions for action. Think about this. We already know DNA is information causing action, and we have not been paying attention to this. The information in DNA can only be described in mathematical terms, and that is now consistent with all the other fields of science. The mathematics and self-organization of biological systems is already understood, but due to the lack of reference to forces, mathematics has not been recognized as the actual cause for action. Biology is the most complex of all unexplained systems, but the most chaotic is the weather. The study of the weather has never had any explanation using physical forces, and now it can be unified with all the other fields of science as having mathematical cause for action. The weather, however, does not have any mechanism for conserving information so it must always remain chaotic. If systems are to increase in self-organization, they require the conservation of information. We have seen that systems are driven by information, but if they are to increase in complexity, they also need to conserve information and then feed it back into the system. The weather cannot do this. The solar system and biology both have mechanisms which conserve and feed back information. Obviously, biology uses DNA, but it's not obvious in the case of the solar system. So here is the explanation. A stable system in space, having 3 or more bodies, must have a dominant body which holds everything in place so orbits can repeat. The Sun and the gas giants all dominate their systems. As the smaller bodies orbit and pass each other, every gravitational tug is transferred to the motion of the other bodies. The information is conserved and fed back into the system. The difference between the tugs gets smaller and smaller until it's all harmonized. Hence, the formation of a periodic repeating pattern. And this is called perturbation theory. The self-organization of the solar system already has an explanation from the mathematics of perturbation theory. We have known this mathematics for a long time, but it has not been recognized as cause for action. If we try to explain the solar system as a clock building itself with the fundamental forces, we get nowhere. Likewise, if we try to explain the behavior of the weather or a chaotic pendulum with fundamental forces, we also get nowhere. The only thing we have to do to repair science is to state that the universe is driven by information in the form of mathematical rules, not fundamental forces. Positive and negative are mathematical properties of matter, not physical ones, so we must change. We can redefine the word force as the transmission of information which causes change. This is already the case in quantum mechanics, which holds the exchange of information via bosons responsible for causing change. All the fields of science can be explained using information as causality, and we now have to choose between 1. An explanation of nature which has no common cause for action. 2. An explanation of nature which has a single, self-consistent cause for action. This would all seem to be so logical and simple, but when it comes to seeing logic, human beings are fatally flawed. Our behavior is corrupted by a paradoxical partnership between sociological drives and logical drives. Logic, or common sense, is overruled by the sociological drive to copy and conform to any nonsense we see around us. This causes the formation of social groups, which we needed in the past to compete with the animal kingdom. But it also means there is nothing too stupid we will not conform to. We have known this for a long time, and it's perfectly depicted in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. We are the only animals which have a brain capable of using logic to get at sense. The brain, however, can also be seduced by complete nonsense. At last, we can see ourselves for what we are. We have become far too comfortable presenting reality in isolated university departments, and we must wake up to the fact that humanity now has the information needed to correct this. The horrors of the history books are testament to what people do without access to the information needed to guide safe social behavior. Our future has the opportunity to be based upon logical rules rather than the sociological compulsions that link us to the animal kingdom. We have something the animal kingdom does not, and that is the ability to rise above our compulsions and work out how we can live without destroying ourselves or the environment. Humanity is now not only self-aware, we are self-understood. And if we conserve that information and feed it back into the system, we have a much better chance of harmonizing with each other and the environment. All right, Darren, I think that was much, much better. We actually got all